This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, this is Sandy Serkes. I am the President and CEO of Valora Technologies, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about auto-classification. This is an advanced technologies workshop provided in concert with ARMA and the ARMA Conference on Information Governance. I'm going to dive right in and give you this presentation. This is a pre-recorded presentation. We're actually giving the workshop live at ARMA next week. But for those of you who couldn't make it or who want this as a reference, this is the pre-recorded. Because it won't be interactive, where I'm just going to be speaking to you directly like this, there will be some parts that I skip over or just go through quickly, and you can go and do on your own. If you are taking the workshop live, these would have been the kind of breakout points where we're having back and forth dialogue, which obviously I can't have at the moment when I'm recording solo. So let's dive in. We're going to talk all about auto classification, everything you could ever want to know. My name is Sandy Serkes, as I said. I've been involved in this industry for longer than I might care to admit. And I also teach on these subjects at the Columbia University Master's Program in Knowledge Management. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to understand exactly what auto classification is and what it is not. We're going to just touch lightly on machine learning and AI. Once we really understand and have command of auto classification, the concept, we are going to understand how it fits within the larger scope of information governance, in case anybody out there really does not know what the letters IG stand for. That is information governance, sometimes also called InfoGov. We're going to talk through some use cases where you tend to see auto classification, both some standardized ones and some specialized ones. We're going to get into the concept of data under management, where auto classification is really running the show for a number of different use cases. Then we're going to talk about some specific case studies, real life customers that use auto classification every day in their organizations, and then how to make the case and build the ROI and the argument for auto classification for your various organizations. I start out my presentation with a funny thought that was shared with me by our marketing person. And it really does kind of highlight what a difference 20 years makes. And in that time frame, the internet and just the amount of content that we are now responsible for as a society has really exploded. I often like to joke around and I'll say, technology really got us into this mess. But the truth is, technology is also going to get us out of this mess. The fact that there are more digital pieces of content than there are human beings means that technology is going to be the thing to manage and analyze them. So this is the fun thought for the day. If you want to see that a little more potently about content, you can take a look at what we call an Internet Minute. This is a fun little graphic that they do every single year, and you can go back and see how things have changed over time. And what's really fascinating is to look at both what is changing and what is not changing. For example, the number of texts that we sent in 2018 and 2019 is almost exactly the same, which might suggest text saturation, whereas some other things like the number of hours we're watching Netflix has basically tripled or doubled. So that's a massive change. In terms of content, and I'm going to use those terms loosely here, we are increasing certainly our amount of content, but we're also increasing the types of content that we create. If you go and look at this, and here's the location where to find it, you will see that happen over time. Twitch obviously being a new one in the last couple of years. So let's talk about the content created world. You will see that content is growing exponentially. You guys probably all knew that. But what I liked about this slide was what type of content, where the dark green, when they say classically created, they mean using software like a Word document or a PowerPoint or something like that. The lighter green is IoT relevant. In other words, IoT is kind of causing it to be. And the teal color is IoT actionable, meaning you might want to take action on that data. So you can see that IoT data in just a handful of years is going to outstrip classic content 2-to-1. But why should we care? We who are in records management or e-discovery or information governance. Well, because with the explosion of content, and by the way, look where we are on this chart, where we're just about to cross the line off the chart. We have more than surpassed already the most rapid period of growth in enterprise content being created. And we should care because it is absolutely overtaking our abilities to manage it. There is more content out there than any of us can physically or even electronically manage. And so we are starting to rely on tools to manage them for us. Anybody unfamiliar with an exabyte? We tend to talk in gigabytes, maybe terabytes, but an exabyte's a billion gigabytes. So just in case you're wondering if this is a big number, the answer is yeah. So, okay, Sandy, how is auto classification going to help us? How is it going to handle that deluge of content? Let's start with some terminology. Depending what walk of life you come from, you may prefer one of these ways of speaking about content than others. I tend to say content because I think it is the broadest of all of these, and it specifically covers what I would sort of call the written word or the textual word. Data can sometimes be just numbers or like a stock ticker, things like that, technically content. But generally in kind of ECM, records management, InfoGov, we are looking at things that are documents or files or records. And so kind of lumping these all together, I tend to default to content, but really any one of these words would suffice for what we're talking about today. So we kind of divide the world of information governance up into 8 pillars, and you'll see them as little balls around the center. While each one is as important as the other, one of them, classification, makes the others possible in an automated way. So ROT, if you're not familiar with ROT, we're going to get into each one of these. ROT is redundant, obsolete, trivial. It's much easier if you have a classification system to tell you what rot is and where it lives than to try and kind of guess that. And you'll see that theme over and over and over. Classification or tagging or coding, whatever your word is, really is kind of the cornerstone to all the other pieces of information governance. And so that's the one we're going to focus on today. So what is classification? Well, it is generally the art of systematically tagging content. So you can think of tags as pieces of metadata, and we're going to get into metadata in a second, that are descriptive or informative about the content itself. So the simplest explanation I can give you is if you are standing in a store and you see a shirt and it has a price tag on it. It probably also has a label for, what the materials are and how to wash it. All of those little tags literally hanging off the shirt, the one sewn into the back and the one on a little plastic dangly thing, those are metadata tags. They are telling you about the shirt. The price tag is telling you about the price. The washing instructions are telling you about the fabrics. And so those are great examples of tags, literally metadata tags on the shirt. And when we have document content, we also have tags. They may not be sewn on or attached by plastic, but they are affiliated with the file itself or with the content itself, and they provide information about the content. Literally, meta means above or beyond, and it's data about data. And so when we're talking about classification, we are adding data. We are supplementing the initial item, let's say the PowerPoint file, with a set of tags that give us information about what's inside. Classification is really the first step in any kind of content lifecycle management, because classification at the very core is going to tell you what this thing is. Oh, it's a t-shirt. It's basically essential so that you can bulk and batch manage content and without having to literally open up every file and look inside. I know people used to do that in the days when we were paper only. You would literally sift through paper and say, what is in here? If you were smart and good, you kept the log, sort of an inventory log. What you were filling out in the log was metadata. Today, this is all done electronically. The data is electronic, most of it, and the tagging itself and the organizational structure, this is all called classification. It's done electronically too. So some of these little boxes that are popping up on the screen, these are part of my dynamic talk when I'm going to be speaking to the class at ARMA. For you all out there in Cyberland, you could maybe just pause when you see them in the corner and just ask the question of yourself. So classification, you can do it manually. You can cut your lawn with scissors if you really, really want to. If you live where I live and there's 2-acre zoning, good luck with that. You better get out there right now. Instead, as human beings with ingenuity and creativity, we come up with solutions and technologies to help us solve our problems. And just like we came up with a lawnmower or a tractor, we have a much more efficient way of cutting the lawn. The same thing is true with classification. You can open up every file, read it, understand the contents, fill out some sort of metadata database, and maintain that, and then edit it every time something changes. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, except for the efficiency aspect and perhaps the inconsistency of human beings with themselves and others over time. But by and large, that does work. It's just not very efficient, and it's not going to get you very far. The amount of content in the universe will keep coming at a pace that's faster than your ability to tag it. And so we need automated methods of handling it. The typical organization looks like this. We have data stored in lots of different locations. Some of it's paper, hopefully it's getting scanned. Most of it today is digital. It's in many different repositories and silos. Often for larger companies, it's all over the world. Even when you're in the cloud, that is hardly a centralized location. You're in a cloud server on which continents? And then finally, of course, format, right? You have it in text, you have it in zipped files, you have it in different languages, there's audio and video mixed in there. So our data as kind of a universe is pretty messy. But that's okay. Where again, technologies are really coming online every day to help manage that. What I want to kind of stress here is that there is today a difference between data where it lives and how it lives, these silos, and data and how it's used. These are the needs down here. And these are just some examples of needs. The point is the data is living where it lives. Once upon a time, we thought, oh, we'll just buy an enterprise content management system. We'll put all our content into the system and life will be great and we'll never have to deal with anything ever again. That lasted for a hot minute until we had email, and then there was Box, and then every app had its own storage mechanism. Anybody out there storing content inside Salesforce? I keep hearing that one lately. And so we have data everywhere, and yet we have needs that cut across all of these locations and purposes. And so what we need in the center is a traffic cop. And that's really the role that auto classification plays. Auto classification is aware of the content where it lives and what it is. It's provided a whole bunch of tags, and then it can use that metadata to serve up the files or maybe just the metadata or some sort of report to the applications and uses that require them on demand. So this notion of serving up content on demand is also called content services. It's a catchphrase put forth by the Gartner Group a couple of years ago, and it's quite fitting for how we manage content today. It lives wherever it lives, and every day there's a new location, and it's being managed by a central kind of inline party that is aware of content but not necessarily physically storing it. and then serving up the content or maybe just the metadata on command to the use cases and the authorized users that are requesting it. So we're going to get into the role that auto classification as traffic cop plays, but conceptually, this is what's going on here. I find this metaphor very helpful. I was a huge fan of Swiss Army knives as a kid. I probably have 3 or 4 of them because they are just such a wonderful little concentrated set of uses, all combined into one handy little device. And that is very much what auto classification is. When you need a corkscrew, it acts like a corkscrew. When you need a file, it acts like a file. And of course, good old variations on knife. So here's what I mean by that. All of these are made possible by the use of classification tags. Yes, you can do some of these without, but if you have proper tagging, you can do all of them. And this is a big theme for auto classification that I hope you guys will take away with you, which is once you are analyzing content for one purpose, you might as well analyze for many purposes. You get a lot of bang for the buck with auto classification because it's literally telling you what that content is across a variety of use cases. So as long as you're kind of spending the effort to go and sort of have software systems analyze content, you might as well have it analyzed for many different uses and purposes at the same time. There's relatively little impact on the processing power and relatively huge results in terms of the value and the use of that content across all these use cases. So let's get into a little bit, we're sort of dancing around artificial intelligence and machine learning. I know there's going to be a million topics on this at ARMA, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But for those who really are uninitiated, artificial intelligence is the much larger category. It is the bucket that all the other technologies fall into. And it's basically an umbrella term meaning technological thinking techniques that are either emulating or presupposing human intelligence. Machine learning is a subset of AI, and it's the one that you tend to see when we're talking certainly about auto classification, but also other tools that are relying on the textual words. So machine learning is absolutely in that category. When we're talking about auto classification, we're talking about textual machine learning and basically using sets of algorithms that can either be trained or use other Bayesian logic so that they can make decisions either similar to how a person would do it or based on a rules-based structure. Generally, I tend to talk about the rules technique. It's a little bit stronger generally than simply mimicking human behavior. But that is kind of a holy war that is playing out right now. Suffice to say, the one you will tend to see, let's say today and for the next maybe 5 years, is going to be textually based machine learning, generally following a provided set of rules. In the broader picture of things, I found this to be a very helpful slide that talks about kind of how AI is evolving over time and where we are today. So we're only here where there's relatively limited capability of AI and machine learning. It's still pretty powerful, but it definitely requires human skill and human setup. When I talk about these rules, the rules are generally created by human beings, or at least at the outset. Sometimes they will auto-populate or change or become kind of self-referential, but they are not being created out of whole cloth themselves, and they're certainly not initiating on their own. And that's the big difference between the second box and the third and fourth. They're really not acting on their own. They're acting at the direction of human beings. Okay, so we've talked about auto classification kind of obliquely, and we're going to dive right now into what it is actually. So in case you didn't pick this up by now, auto classification is actually computer software that is performing an automated analysis of document content. So it's going into a document or into a file, literally looking at the content that's inside and using some machine learning techniques to come up with a set of tags. So in other words, right in the beginning, I talked about the shirt in the store. Imagine if the shirt did not have the tag in the back with the washing instructions and did not have the price tag. What's happening is the software is kind of looking at this piece of cloth and saying, looks a lot like a shirt. It's got 2 sleeves and a neck, and it looks just like the shirt next to it that I know for sure is a shirt. I'm going to go with shirt. And then it's going to say, well, the shirt next to it, which is a really close match, is retailing for $15.99. So that's the most likely price that this shirt is, the one without the tag. So, with X number of confidence, we're going to claim that to be the price, and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit how auto classification works. It's using algorithms. What I just described to you, I gave you a closest matched algorithm. I said, what's the closest t-shirt to this one? That is essentially an algorithm to try and determine attributes about the content. The most important attribute is, of course, the document type. The records folks in the audience will think of record type. Some will think of that as form or template, but basically trying to get down to what type of content, what type of file is this? I don't mean it's a JPEG or a PDF. That could be anything. I mean, it's a cash flow statement. It's a hospital admission form. It's a W-2 tax filing. That's what we mean when we say document type. And if you can get to that level of recognition, then a lot of additional metadata attributes open up for you. Let's take the W-2 tax form. And my apologies to international folks, this is a US tax form. It is the most standard tax form on the planet for American citizens. But basically, because it's a tax form, and once you can recognize that it is, then you know that there's going to be a tax ID number on there, and there's going to be a person's name, the filer of the taxes. There's going to be an employer if that person is employed. And so you can kind of guess, if you have confidence in the document type, that helps limit down the additional type of metadata that you would expect to find in that document. So for example, if you can hone in and say, yep, that's definitely a tax form, you're not going to be looking for a medical record number on let's say an income tax form, because it has nothing to do with it. You're not going to be looking for latitude, longitude. And so nearly any descriptor of content would count as a metadata tag. But once you have narrowed down to your correct zone of document type, now you can kind of play games with probability about what types of fields you would expect to find with that document type. It also works the other way, which is if you're able to determine fields in some content, you can probably back into what the document type is. So let's say you were looking for fields like, okay, home address, bank loan company, loan number, state of residence, homeowner's name. Okay, you can tell I'm describing a mortgage document. And so you can, that analysis around document type and document type serving as the cornerstone to everything else works both directions. You can either start with document type, or you can back into it, or you can go both directions and kind of cross-reference your assumptions both ways. And so that's one of the key tricks about how auto classification works, because if you can narrow down your kind of first order of analysis to say, what kind of document am I dealing with, and therefore what should I expect, the rest of it becomes quite simple. And so you can get extremely rich content analytics out of that technique. The software that I am familiar with recognizes more than 600 different fields of metadata. They're not all going to be applicable, certainly on any data population, and for sure not on any specific document, but it doesn't have to assess 600 at a time, because once it narrows down on document type and other things, then you can really narrow down the effort considerably, and that makes both the precision and the recall so much stronger. And so ultimately, Auto-classification is a set of software algorithms that live in the middleware. Remember that traffic cop picture? Living between where the content lives in whatever format it's in, and providing a kind of a filter and control system for serving up content or metadata or both on command. In short, auto-classification is a combination of rich metadata and rules. We'll get into both of them in just a second.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, but let's take a deeper dive now on what it means to actually classify content in general and what is really the difference between a manual approach and an automated approach. So this is a manual approach, some software application. Everybody's seen these. When you go to either hit save or send, a screen pops forward and forces you to enter metadata. That's effectively what you're doing. You might be setting document type or a custodian or some sort of retention rules, and then you have to click OK to get out of it. Again, nothing wrong with this, except it's quite tedious. People hate it, and they take whatever tips and tricks and side ways, shortcuts that they can to get out of these things. Many of them come with a button like same as last, and everybody goes, yes, 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 oh, thank God, so that they don't have to enter this stuff. They also will always choose, if it's a drop down, they'll choose the A. It'll always be aardvarks in, America, because that's the first one on the pick list, and it lets them out of this horrible, kind of pop-up. Compare that technique, which is, by the way, requiring the user to be an expert on every single piece of content that they create. Not just a subject matter expert on the content, but on the treatment of content. And to my knowledge, very few employees are intimately familiar with their company's retention schedule to know exactly what type of retention policy to set for what exact type of content. Instead, we have automated classification, which is operating in the background. Typically, the users do not see this. It's happening kind of outside of their world and running on the textual basis. So it's looking at that file content, coming up with a full rich set of fielded data, that's that metadata tagging, and then automatically coming up with a disposition. Now, this could push forth to the user, especially it would, if you wanted, it could use something like this and just kind of come out auto-populated. This is what the system thinks your tag should be. Are you okay with that? Or it could just do it in the background and not tell the user and just be there and available for whatever uses may come next. To be honest with you, most of the clients that we see choose the latter. They want to get this out of their users and their employees' faces and have a centralized command of tagging that is systematically consistent across the organization, even in and out of languages. And so, not surprisingly, automated classification is gaining traction. The days of manual classification are probably going to be ending, except for the most sophisticated of cases where it is too hard, at least at present, for software to emulate that human knowledge set. But for your run-of-the-mill things, what type of record is this? Where should it be stored? Who should have access? That is definitely being supplanted by automated classification. And so the trick to those tags is, of course, metadata. Again, we already talked about what metadata means, but it's very important because people don't always realize just how much metadata is available to be had, and how easy that is. And that's because they're thinking of it as a manual process. Well, the only metadata that can exist would be whatever Microsoft gives me at the file level and whatever I feel like slogging through one of those screens to add myself. And that's the big difference. What auto classification will do is create that metadata for the user or for the system admins so that people don't have to do that anymore. And it helps you distinguish one piece of content from another when on the surface, They may look identical. I mean, they're both PDFs. They're the same size, created the same day, same custodian. But of course, when I say that out loud, that sounds laughable. Of course, they could be monstrously different. And that's where metadata comes in. I have a nifty little video for you guys that I'm just going to play the beginning on this recording because I have tried dozens of ways to get the volume to come up, and something about this recording technique, it's keeping the volume very quiet for you. So I'm just going to play the very beginning. And the link is actually, when you receive this as a kind of a PowerPoint, this button, you can actually notice when I hover over it, that's the link. So you can go to that link and watch the video in its entirety. It is fantastic. It's great. And it's done with a lovely sense of humor, where instead of a document that you might provide metadata for, they are providing a candy bar and the metadata that you would need for a candy bar. And it's just fantastic. I will play a little bit of it for you, and hopefully just listen very carefully. Okay, I'm going to pause that there. It goes on for quite a bit. It's just a spectacular video. I highly recommend you guys watch it. And more importantly, share it with the people in your organization who need to understand what metadata is and why it's so very valuable to the practice of information governance. Okay, so now let's understand rich metadata in an enterprise content context. So some of you may have seen my famous balloons before. I've been using the balloons for a long time because they are examples of metadata or tags or classification. Those of you who kind of come from an e-discovery background are going to recognize this red balloon as the type of file metadata that kind of comes along just with the natural creation of a file. Those of you who are in records are probably going to recognize the date balloon because dates are very important in the management and retention periods of records. But which date exactly, right? I mean, the RM folks know very well a date is not a date is not a date. Take something like a contract that may have all of these dates present on it. And so the balloons are really just an attempt to have people understand what are various tags of metadata. And this is just a light smattering of the kinds of fields that are possible to tag with auto classification. This is maybe 20, 30 fields on here. As I said earlier, there are well over 600 and new ones are cropping up every day. One thing that I would ask you to think about is what attributes and tags make sense for your organization. Are you structured by departments? Then department name might be a very useful tag. Are you an employee heavy organization like a retailer? Then you might want to use employee number as an important tag. Are you a pharmaceutical with new drugs coming out every day? Drug name. Or the lab might be important tags for you. And so those are the things for you all as the kind of information governance influencers and leaders in your organizations. Those are the things you want to start thinking about. If you could tag your content for literally anything, what tags would make sense for you? And don't limit yourself to 2 or 3 because it's not being done by hand anymore. It's being done by software. So live a little. Think of 10 fields, 20 fields. I can tell you that the typical auto classification implementation is generally looking for about 20 to 30 fields. Do not go looking for 100. It's too much for people to process, even if it's easy for the software, because eventually that's going to come back. It's going to manifest as a report or a data dashboard or maybe tags in SharePoint or some sort of portal. And so you want, even though the tags may be useful for searching, you want to think about also don't inundate your ultimate users or the folks retrieving information. Don't have them be overwhelmed by metadata. They're already overwhelmed by content, and the metadata is a way to kind of abstract one layer. You don't want to make that so cumbersome that it's not helpful either. So walk the line between too few and too many, and experiment. That's really one of the nice things about auto classification is you can always run again with different parameters. And so if you want to add a field or take away a field, that's a pretty small deal. Okay. But don't we have some rich metadata now? Sandy, you keep saying rich metadata, rich metadata. The answer is sort of. We have some metadata now. We know that this is a JPEG file, file extension. We know the size of the file. We have the path name and the creation date and the last modified date. Okay, good start. That doesn't really tell me anything of what it's about. And so we sort of have rich metadata, but we sort of don't. There is one place where we do have rich metadata, and that is in our structured content. So we're going to get into in a moment the difference between structured content and unstructured content. But structured content, in a nutshell, is a database. Even an Excel spreadsheet is sort of structured, but the most common example is a database, whereas unstructured data is data like email, just word processing documents, correspondence. The easiest way to think about is it structured or unstructured? The first question is it in a database? If the answer is yes, then yeah, it's structured. Check. If it's not in a database, probably you're unstructured. But here's the easiest test for unstructured, which is the body content that you're looking at, could that be any length? If the answer is yes, then you're in unstructured content. So think about an email. An email could be one word, yes. Responding to an email, going out to dinner, yes. Okay, so it could be one word, or it could be pages and pages and pages of someone's diatribe or a 47 times forwarded email conversation. So that's what I mean by could it be any length? Here's another example, a bill of lading, right, from some packaging manufacturer. And so here comes your Amazon order. You could have one item listed there, or you could have 56 items listed there. And so that variable length of content is kind of a telltale sign that you've got unstructured data. And so the rich metadata that we have today, it does exist, but it's limited, tends to be found in structured data databases, and or it was put in by hand using one of those manual systems. Those, although we have that rich metadata, it's generally not trustworthy and not good. By and large, what we see is people throwing that metadata out because, as I said, people will cheat and cut corners wherever they can. And so that's actually worse than having no metadata because you have incorrect metadata. So we really, really caution you to be careful about metadata that's been entered by hand, quote unquote, under duress. Basically, if you prevent someone from saving a file or sending a file, they're going to do whatever they have to do to they may just hit period, period, period and go. That is pointless metadata. All it is clutter. So we really caution you against metadata that's been put in by hand. If you're looking for an example of structured metadata, or you're trying to explain to folks in your organization, structured data isn't the problem. It comes with metadata. It's everything else. So that's what you see here. So this is a really good example of structured data. This is sort of an Amazon-like online bookseller that will give you a picture of the book, details, the ISBN number, the price. This is structured data because this is being stored in a back-end database with a field name of price and a value of £7.99. This is the other technique similar to what I showed you earlier. And again, they're either going to be ridiculously overcomplicated like this one, or it's going to be highly subject to error and negligence. Don't do this. Okay. And what we're kind of experiencing here is sort of a sea change in how we manage content and whose responsibility it is. Historically, we have had kind of a top-down approach where an organization, let's say legal or records, has said, all right, these are going to be the record types. We're going to kind of shove this onto all the employees in the organization, make an attempt to teach them what a record is and how to distinguish one from the other, and ask them to please tag their content with retention dates. Okay. By and large, that has not worked very well. It only works in the situations where people are, as I said, under duress. They're being forced to do it, and then they're basically faking it. And so what is happening is this sea change to a different technique, which is the bottom-up technique, which is content forward. So start with the content itself. Let the content tell you what it is. Hi, I'm a correspondence between the supplier and us, and I am discussing matters of price and volume discounts. I am dated October 12th, and so on and so forth. And when I'm saying I am the content speaking, and I'm basically speaking in tags. So it's as if I was a letter, let's say on the letterhead, and I was speaking out the salient data points that are part of my content. Hey, I'm addressed to ABC Supply. They are the recipient of this content. Okay, so your tag is sort of recipient and the value is ABC Supply. And so this technique is really relying on the content itself to speak for itself, as opposed to having people make decisions in a way that they are not comfortable or prepared to do. And one of the big changes as we cross this line is whose responsibility is it to manage content? Above the line, that responsibility is on the people, and it's kind of requiring this group of what I would call encyclopedic experts. I am amazed at the level of knowledge that RIM personnel have about their retention schedules. The problem is that that is sort of it becomes impossible the more distributed your organization and the types of content get. And those types of people, these encyclopedic experts, are becoming more and more rare. Instead, the smarts are being built into systems. Software can recognize that content, probably not as good as the RIM expert, but certainly better than the layman employee. And that's the bang for the buck. And so designing these systems to be content first, content forward, and having the systems recognize and communicate with one another is where we are heading. This is a much more cost efficient and kind of centralized organization approach than this top one. Okay, so what does rich metadata actually get you at the end of the day? The very first, the most important thing is that it lets you know what kind of content you have. And I don't mean that you have 42,000 PDFs. I mean you have 6,000 supplier contracts and 4,000 termination forms and so on and so forth. Remember that whole discussion about document type? That is what the very first thing that classification is going to give you. Let you know what kind of content you have, package that up in the form of tags, and then allow you to manage your content by tag. That's bulk or kind of subset content management that is self-aware. So for example, you could just manage ROT, or you could just manage sales forecasts from 2015. I combined two fields there. I combined doc type, sales forecast, and date. And so that allows kind of context-aware decisioning, management, and of course, searches. It lets you also see across data repositories with, frankly, no particular favoritism to one or another. Because the metadata is stored in that abstracted middleware layer, it's available to all, even if access isn't. I mean, obviously assuming permissions, but leaving that out, what you have is this fantastic ability to do data visualization. Because once you have those metadata tags from across the various repositories and storage mechanisms, you can make a centralized display that not only is kind of divided up by data facet or by tag, but also by source, so that you can see cross source, single source, maybe only a subset of sources, only show me data from the Netherlands. Okay, lots of different options in the presentation and reporting on content. And then finally, I just mentioned a new word, facet. So a data facet is basically like a data tag. It's a way of looking at content. You can think of it almost like a lens. And then you can kind of use that lens to take actions. So one data facet might be the creation date of the content. Another data facet might be the custodian who is holding that data. Another data facet might be product name. So lots of different ways to think about data facets. Once you've tagged with auto classification for these different types of facets, you can manage your content via facet. And you don't have to start with this shoving requirements down onto employees. You can do it in this centralized kind of data presentation manner. Okay, so that takes us to context, because what we've been building up to so far is kind of understanding metadata, understanding auto classification, and what does it really bring to the table. Because what I'll sometimes hear is people say, well, can't I just search? I have really nice search tools. I can search across all my content. Why can't I just search? What difference does it make? Who's the author or the source where it came from? Again, most of you are probably laughing because you guys know the answer, but the folks you serve, the constituents in your organization, don't. To them, a search is complete and tells you everything you need to know, and that's because they don't understand context. And so this is one of my favorite cartoons. I do it almost every single time I present because it is the best way to explain context to someone who thinks that searching is the answer. And so I present to you, I wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. Aw, so sweet. That's a little doggy asking if he could climb under your desk and take a nap. Oh, sure, little doggy. It's a little bit different if an employee makes the same question or the same statement, the exact same words in a different context. If this guy is working for you and you're paying him, let's say by the hour, you would be pretty ticked. Mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap? You bet I mind. Not okay. Let's change the context again. Oh dear, it's a hobo. Wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. Oh my gosh, that's terrible, but probably not appropriate in the middle of a bank or wherever these folks are. Maybe they're in a school. Not really okay. That's awful. Okay, very, very different context. Again, same words. And then finally, unless you already live in Nashville, I'm going to let you think about this one on the way home. I wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. Let's hope not. Obviously, there are rules against that, but it's a frightening thought nonetheless. Very, very different than if the pilot of your plane home is saying, once again, those exact same words. And so the point here is that if you did a search for this phrase across your enterprise population, you would find all four of these come up and they would feel identical. They would result in a search results listing, and they would all have the same kind of likelihood because they were all being searched on the same way, content only. There's no context. So the very first context you might add let's say as a metadata tag, is the speaker or the custodian or the author. Who is the one saying this? Is it a cute little dog or is it an airplane pilot? Those are very different, and you can very well imagine a field, a metadata field, an auto classification tag called speaker. Okay, speaker, and then the value is worker, hobo, pilot, dog. Okay, another context you might have is, let's say, scene or circumstance. Circumstance, home office, regular office. I'm going to go with library. And air travel. Very, very different. And that's the point of tagging, is it brings context to the content. Okay. So up until this point, I've been focusing very heavily on metadata. Right in the beginning, you may remember that I said auto classification is a combination of two things: rich metadata tagging, I think you've got that one now, and rules. So now we're kind of entering the second part. What are rules? So once again, rules are software algorithms that are determining the disposition of content. I am using the word disposition here in a much broader sense than you would typically encounter in the records management world. RM folks tend to use disposition to mean, when does this content get deleted or destroyed? I use disposition to basically mean actioning of any kind at any time. So for example, oh, this piece of content needs to migrate to that cloud location. I would consider that a disposition. Or this type of content has personal data and needs to be locked down or needs to be forgotten based on a data subject access request. I would consider all of those to be forms of disposition. So when we say that rules are software algorithms that determine the disposition of content, we're using a very broad definition of that here. So here's an example of a simple rule. They typically follow what we call an if-then format. So if a document type is a contract, and let's say the effective date is before this date, which is rapidly running out, isn't it? Then mark that file as active, because that is essentially its retention. This is a retention rule, very simple rule. And you can see the interplay between metadata and rules. These italicized words are basically field names or metadata tags. And the auto classification has determined what the value of that tag is. Remember, document type, there it is. The value is contract, and the date is less than this point. So that's the auto classification now doing the rules bit, saying, here are the little tags that I came up with, doc type and date. Now I'm going to apply them in a sort of mathematical rule way. And if the condition is met, then the following disposition should be taken. And so this is kind of like a little baby retention rule. They can get much, much more complex. They can get hierarchical. They can be dependent on other things. You can have a field day with rules once you really get into it. And they don't, of course, always have to be about retention. They can be about nearly any potential disposition, again, any potential action or marking that you could have in information governance, even including things like legal hold. And so once you understand kind of how the rules dispositioning works, then you understand that all of these are potential mechanisms for handling content that can be done with rules. So you no longer need people to sit there and say, oh yes, this file has personal data, and the personal data is social security number, date of birth, and I'm too lazy to finish. Now the software will do it automatically. It will not only will it say, hey, that's the social security number over there, but it will flag it as sensitive personal data. Let's say subject to GDPR or CCPA. If you don't know what those terms are, definitely go attend a couple of the sessions here at ARMA about data privacy. It's a little beyond the scope of this session on auto classification, but suffice to say, those are data privacy regulations. And so once you kind of master the concept of, oh, rules let me interplay those various classification tags, then you have the full picture of auto classification. You have the metadata tagging, you have the rules dispositioning, and you're now accomplishing real information governance goals live on the fly and perpetually. That's a big theme we're going to come back to in a little while. All right. Again, you're going to hear this theme. I kind of mentioned it earlier in terms of tagging only, but I'm going to mention it again in terms of rules, which is if you could do any one of these rules, which one would you do? Or would you do them all? Why not do them all? Again, once the software is processing for one, you might as well process for all of them. There is major bang for the buck in doing so. Okay, we're going to stop there and I'm going to take a short break.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hi everybody, we're back. And we were just finishing up kind of an overview of what rules are. And now we're going to move on to understand what rules really bring to the table. Remember this picture from before where I said auto classification is really kind of, classification is really driving all the other pillars of information governance. Now we have a little more detail. It's really the rules that are the key to unlocking every single one of these. So with rules, you can satisfy different types of compliance, different types of identification and awareness, and of course, disposition in the more traditional definition here. So we are going to, with the rest of this presentation, dive into each one of these and understand how auto classification really drives them to fruition. So first, let's make sure we really understand how auto classification works. So the first thing that happens is that an auto classification engine is, let's say, given permission to crawl a repository, a file share, email server, what have you, and either ingest data or more likely processes the files in place. If you're unfamiliar with that concept, what that means is the files live where they live. The auto processing agent comes for a little visit, comes for a little tea, checks out the file, and leaves, leaving the file intact, available, and sort of unobstructed. Ingestion, you tend to see that more on the e-discovery side of things, tends to occur when you have a copy of data for some reason, in which case data goes right into the system. But by and large, processing files in place is the typical way it's done. And one way or another, we are getting to text. For native files, we're going to extract that text automatically. For paper images that have been, paper documents that have been scanned to image, we're going to use OCR. Again, outside the scope of this presentation, but if you're wondering how OCR functions and becomes kind of a baseline level of text, either contact me offline or take a look on my YouTube channel because I go into it in great detail. But basically, we're going to get to text. And even those files that don't normally have text, you don't think of as text, like audio or video files, using speech-to-text algorithms, you can get a text rendition. Typically, auto classification engines will run in the language in which they've been built. So you have some auto translation, but sometimes they can run in other languages as well. If you have a multilingual population, definitely check with your provider as to whether they can support that. And so this first step is basically a pure processing step of getting to useful text. And then once we have useful text, that tagging effort begins. Go through, I sometimes call this gene sequencing, where we're basically going to gene sequence a file or a document and pull out every little piece of metadata that is relevant to that content, store that away in a little metadata file, a metadata database. and then use that to make dispositioning decisions. Create a destination or an action or a status. And so that is the sequence of events. That is how auto classification works. And, kind of lather, rinse, repeat across different populations. And then once you've got like a baseline run, then perpetually, because things are constantly changing. Data is being added, data is being removed, regulations are changing, and requirements on data and for the management and use of data change. And so this, I want to stress with you guys that this is not a one and done thing. This is a perpetual, evergreen use of technology to manage content. Okay. This is what it looks like. Whoop, ooh, that went very quickly. Once you have done all the work. So the tags, you can see examples of tags here: doc type, date, title, authors, activity, geographic, again, whatever you want your fields to be. And you can see kind of in the background, these are those data facets. Here's activity, state, wholesaler, title. And all of these are different ways of visually representing data in a kind of graphical cross-repository way so that the user can literally just enter a search or click on a facet and bring up whatever it is they want to bring up. Okay, so let's get into those details of all the little pillars of information governance and how auto classification helps. Okay, so just a quick reminder, we processed it, we tagged it, and we ran our rules. Now we go. What is it we'd like to visit first? Let's go over to the rot category, okay? Let's see some auto classification in action. Okay. What is rot? Redundant, obsolete, or trivial? Is a polite way of saying junk. All the things that just accumulate in our emails, in our file shares, in our cloud storage, in abandoned collaborative work sites. And so that's all expensive. One way or another, our organizations are paying for that in terms of storage, in terms of lost productivity time, in terms of clutter. And so there's a very valid and useful reason to rid ourselves of rot. I did not mention this earlier, but risk and exposure is another one. And so there are many, many reasons to kind of get the junk out, to remove rot. So what's the risk of rot? Well, as I said, there's expense. Okay, here's an example of what that might be costing if you're working for a large company. The productivity, this is cut off a little. We tried to give attribution to our findings. This last one, the attribution is to Valora. This is what we see across our clients. So between the cost, the lost productivity, and the risk, keeping rot is really a big mistake. And it is the easiest way to build an ROI. Typically 30 to 40% of all content in an organization is rot. That is a massive number and an outrageous amount of expenditure. And for those of you that are in process of moving up into the cloud's going to charge you X dollars per gigabyte per month. The cloud doesn't care whether that's a legit file or rot. You're going to pay the same either way. It's basically like as if you never threw your garbage out, but simply let it, accumulate in your driveway. Eventually, your driveway would be covered in garbage. And that is really what's happening. So how do we auto-classify rot? Here's a great example. It's a classic piece of rot. A well-meaning person, sent out a Christmas card in 2014, sent it to everybody in the company, and boom, there it is. Now rot taking up everybody's email inbox and the original sender's outbox while we're at it. And so what you see, these kind of blue bullets on the right, this is the software doing its thing, uh, going through and creating metadata tags for the type of content that it encounters. So one key metadata tag, of course, is what we call the watch list. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, it's a boy, it's a girl, Mazel Tov, and so on. And so those are almost never going to be of any kind of business value. So they're kind of an indicator, a clue that what you're looking at might be rot. The date, nearly 5 years ago now, suggests kind of not that valid. There's no further content and heavy graphics. So the signal to noise ratio is quite poor. There's 4,000 identical copies in the organization. There's enough clues here that kind of push it over and say, yeah, that's rot. And so the blue here represents that metadata tagging step, tag, 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 and the black is the rules saying, okay, given all the clues you've given me, metadata, we're going to go ahead and call it for junk, rot. Okay, and so it gets tagged as rot, and then that would be sort of the rot tag in this case would be trivial. And then what type of disposition should different types of rot have? Trivial rot should be removed. So you have a kind of a combination here of what type of rot and what type of rot handling. And it's a good example of how specific you really can get. Okay, that was rot. Let's jump on over to retention. All right. So retention, if you're not familiar with that term, and some of you may not be, is the sort of systematic management of content, what we often call content lifecycle management. Content is born, it has a useful life, and then it generally sort of dies or is disposed of properly and at the right time and under the right circumstances. We call that a retention schedule. And it is structured generally either as a record schedule or a retention policy. And these are sort of like the 10 commandments of content handling. So thou shalt treat this type of content in this type of manner. And then when this content is no longer useful or needed, thou shalt destroy it in the following manner. And so that type of handling of content over its life cycle is often kind of shorthand called retention. Generally, retention policies and schedules are quite difficult to implement and execute, particularly on electronic data. And again, this gets back to that discussion we had about top-down versus bottom-up. Most organizational retention schedules that I have seen, I have a minimum of about 50 different record types and handling, and the more extensive ones are well into the several hundreds. Very unlikely that any Joe employee is going to be an expert in all of that. And so they're difficult to implement, and what most people do is not. They just simply do not classify things as records, again, unless under duress. And so the approach is, well, I'll just keep everything and therefore I can't get into any trouble. And again, not really the most intelligent or informed technique for content management. And so having automated retention analysis and handling is a great antidote to that. One thing I will point out, I know not every organization has quite the maturity level yet to necessarily have a record schedule or a policy. For those that are getting there or who already have one, be very careful that you don't get yourself into a dangerous place. If you are not really going to execute according to your published policy, that is the most dangerous position you can get into, because you are effectively violating your own policy by doing that, and courts will not look favorably on that.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, for those of you who are unfamiliar with retention schedules, I grabbed a couple of publicly available ones. They're both great. You can certainly use these as examples for your own organization if you don't have one or if you just want to compare notes. Okay. One of the things that auto classification brings to the table, we already talked about the notion of context. The second thing that it does is kind of give a spectrum of views. And so, for example, it's easy to think that content needs to be either kept or disposed of, that it's black and white. And the truth is, it's not. Some content fits that bill, yes. Rot should be removed. There's no business value in that, especially things that are redundant. That's ridiculous. Why would you keep multiple copies of something? And then the corollary, there are things that are classified as permanent record, permanent. They are never to be thrown out ever. Those are the keep forever. And those are the ends of the spectrum. But there is what I call the squishy middle. Things that are under legal hold obviously cannot be disposed of, but for how long? How many organizations put something under legal hold and then forget to take it off long after that the litigation has come and gone? There are things under legal hold from 2010. The litigation ended in 2013, but nobody ever came back and said, oh yeah, legal hold's lifted. And so we eventually everything we own is going to be under legal hold, and all we're doing is just creating a giant pile of rot that's protected. So we want to be really careful of legal hold. We've been very good about implementing holds. We've been horrific about removing them. Similarly, we have, this is new, DSARs, Data Subject Access Requests. These are coming up obviously in Europe under GDPR, but just now going to be starting in January from California under CCPA, where let's say California resident has the right to be forgotten or the right to know what you have on them. And so a data subject access request is essentially removal on demand. I request that you remove that content on me. It's not rot, but it is going to have to follow a removal disposition action plan. Again, a little bit squishier, and only that content that fits the bill. And then finally, we have active files. Should we keep them? Should we remove them? How long are they active file? What if they were active yesterday, but not tomorrow? Where is the line? And so this is what I call the squishy middle. Also the orphan data. Sorry, I forgot about that one. The orphan data, all the data that poor neglected data that nobody's looking at, like all the content from the folks who've left the company, or prior collaborative or like deal room type of online content storage. The deal was closed, just like legal hold. Everybody left it there. Everybody moved on to the next deal. And so orphan data you tend to see also in what I call this squishy middle ground, which really could use some retention analysis, not just once, but over and over again forever. There's that perpetual evergreen theme. Okay, so this takes us into two different techniques for managing content over time. I know a number of organizations are looking to implement simple time-based strategies. What I mean by that is something like, well, any content that is older than 3 years, according to last modified date, in other words, it has been viewed or modified in the last 3 years, we're automatically going to go and delete that. A similar version, you hear it with email. Anything older than 90 days is going out. As soon as we hit day 91, that's it. Boom. The angel of death comes by and sweeps out your files. I am not a big proponent of time-based removal techniques. I understand their simplicity and cost, but I think they exert an inordinate pain onto the user base by accident, because time-based techniques are blind. It's the equivalent of someone wearing a blindfold and literally running through a china shop with, bats in their arms. It's not the smartest way to remove content. You run a serious risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't think that these are going to last as good techniques because of that. particularly because value-based techniques are readily available and are so much more precision oriented about what should go and what should stay and why. So for example, these are two legitimate emails that came from my email. Even though we have 97 million spam filters, somehow this Target ad got through. Classic spam. And it's sitting in my email, and it's going to sit there for 90 days, assuming I have one of those 90-day automatic sweeps. It's going to sit there for 90 days. In my opinion, that's 89 days longer than it needs to. This should be kind of removed on site. If it's not caught by the spam filter, it would be caught by auto classification. Just a quick refresher. And this is where when I'm in the classroom with the folks at ARMA at the conference, I'm going to ask, how would auto classification know that this is spam? So I'll give you a quick second to think about that, and then I'll answer. For starters, it's going to look at the text. It's going to look at the author. The author is local deals, alert, alert. It's going to look at the words, congrats, you've been selected. It's going to see $50 promotion, exclusive rewards. Again, it's going to say that this is spam. It knows, okay? So this is something that we're going to keep for 89 days too many. And this, just because I didn't touch it, because I, like everybody else in the universe, literally use my email and my folders as a storage mechanism, as a repository, because I just do, this would get thrown out. And this is probably the only copy of that signed proposal between us, because yeah, I'm a user and I'm lazy and I didn't bother to call this a record or move it into the records retention repository. It's literally just sitting in my email. Okay. And so this is going to get killed on that time-based technique. And so both of these are wrong. This is too long. This is too short, because both of them are relying on me, the user, to take the action, and I'm just too busy. And so wouldn't it be better if it was value-based, where the spam was recognized immediately and rooted out, and important, obviously, records retention-based content would be handled accordingly? Okay, so this is what automated retention looks like using auto classification. So the first thing we're going to do is recognize the type of content. What doc type is it? Therefore, what record type is it? Therefore, what schedule is it subject to? And therefore, what type of expiration handling or expiry does it have? It's never meant to expire. It has a defensible deletion at 5 years. I can look at my data facets and see what's coming up for expiration, what's coming up for deletion, and I can take a look here explicitly. Okay, this is what auto classification brings to the table, and I, the user, didn't really do anything. I literally just logged in and said, well, what do you got for me, auto classification? And this is one of the big use cases. Okay, let's jump over to data in flight. Data in flight, what is that? No, I don't mean the pilot anymore. This is a phrase that was coined by the IGI, and I really like it, and so I've stuck with it. Data in flight is basically data that is expressly moving from one place to another, or from one source to another, or one responsible party to another. So where do you see data in flight? Sometimes when, let's say, a repository is being sunset and you're moving to a new one, data is going to move. Very popular these days, migrating content up to the cloud. When there's a responsibility transfer, such as with mergers and acquisitions or a divestiture. And so, or when people, like layoffs, very common. Okay, content is either going to move physically or move responsibility, or there's some sort of thing happening, a litigation, an investigation, an inquiry. These are other reasons that essentially content is being kind of brought forward, shall we say. So that's what data in flight is. And this is how auto classification is used. So first of all, it's used to find the content. So we're going to be divesting blah blah business unit. So we're going to need everything pertaining to their employees, to their products, to their supplier contracts, to their customer base, pretty much everything related to that business. We need to find it, identify it, and then probably take some kind of action. So what have we got? Again, let's find it, let's tag it, and then let's take some actions. Okay, this is going to go to the new entity, this is going to stay with us, or here's some content that kind of needs to go to both. We need to keep it and they need to get it, whatever is going to be happening in that divestiture. And then what we would call set it and forget it. So thanks to, I forgot his name. They told me his name and I forgot it, but thanks to him for the phrase and the picture. And go on and put those rules in place and yes, literally set it and forget it. And let that action continue to take place, either on demand or on schedule. And so since data in flight, I would say the number one data in flight, it's probably M&A, but the number two is going to be migration to the cloud. And I really wanted to take a moment and talk about that because there is so much kind of dumb migration going on, just like this. This is migrating the wrong way. Do not move your home, wherever it is that your home is, in this manner. This is a disaster waiting to happen. And this is exactly what people do for cloud migration. They literally just lift and shift from, let's say, a behind the firewall file share. They just grab everything, throw it up in the cloud, dump it into OneDrive or whatever you're doing with the exact same folder taxonomy and content migration. Don't do that. That is equivalent to, if let's say you're moving from one apartment to another, you're going to take all your furniture, you empty the trash before you carry the garbage pail from the old apartment to the new one. You do not set up the garbage pail in the new apartment with the garbage in it from the old apartment. And that's what a straight lift and shift is. We strongly recommend you not do that because you are never going to clean it up after that. And you are going to be paying for storage of 30 to 40% rot. So we really recommend that you separate the baby from the bathwater and not migrate the garbage. Do not just replicate folder structures. They were probably made ad hoc and without any kind of concentrated or centralized forethought. SharePoint, by the way, I won't go into this too much because there are other programs and presentations on this, but SharePoint is smarter than that. It does not require such strict folder taxonomy to accomplish the same things. What SharePoint is really looking for is metadata and tags, and it sort of effectively folders on the fly. Yet another score for auto classification, which sets SharePoint up to do that. Another thing that people do the wrong way is they provide broad departmental access to all content. That is going to get tougher, tougher and tougher to justify. The more we talk about data privacy, the more we talk about security access, the more we're going to have to lock down content at the file level, not the departmental or folder level. And then the last thing they do, they go ahead and migrate and they remind everybody, keep that data clean. Yeah, sure. Anyone who has a teenager knows how that works out when you remind your teenager to keep the room clean. Good luck with that. The only way that that really works is when there's a penalty involved that says, you know, you can't go out with your friends until you clean the room. So this is what we would call migrating the wrong way, as opposed to migrating the right way. Classify, organize. You can, I love this photo because it's just such an on-point metaphor. Everything here is tagged. Not only is it tagged what, think of it as like doc type, but also with context, fragile. And probably they were smart enough to put the fragile things on top of the heavier things. Again, location. And so The way to migrate properly is to tag first, then migrate. I would also recommend, I know there's not that many tools that are out there that do this, but there are some, and obviously I know some, where you can stream the migration. Most migration today is done by batch. In other words, get everything ready and then do this huge heavy lift, let's say over into the cloud. One thing that auto classification gives you is the ability to stream on the fly. And so your auto classification kind of hits your first file, determines what it is, where it belongs, and then goes ahead and moves that file. And it's doing that automatically as it goes. And one of the nice things about that is it's not a heavy burden on systems, and it's not, waiting 3 days for content to transfer. It's on the fly and it's streamed. So it's much kind of softer impact on the infrastructure and therefore much faster. Obviously use auto classification tools to do this and validate the results at the end. Don't just migrate and hope it all turned out okay. We see way too much of that. One of the nice things is if you are using auto classification tools, you go to validate and you see an issue, you fix it here in the auto classifier and it will just automatically fix. So that's yet another reason to use auto classification when you're migrating. Okay, I've kind of beat the continuous monitoring to death, I think. Okay, let's move into data privacy and data security. We'll kind of look at those two together. So obviously, I kind of hinted at this earlier. Everyone is concerned about data privacy. Thank you to Europe for consolidating your many regulations into GDPR and for really kicking off awareness in the rest of the world as to just how much of our data is being used against us. And so you're starting to see different types of regulations, yes, in the US. Our marketing person is from Canada, so she put that up in there, and across the world. This is only going to get worse. And it is high time that all of us took control of our enterprise information and figured out what do we have and how much of it is subject to data privacy regulation. You would be surprised just how very much and where it lives. I will share with you all the biggest surprise location for sensitive content for data privacy is in email. You know it's in the HR files, you know it's in the customer files, and you can lock those down and search them accordingly. Email is the open door, both in and out of your organization. It has all kinds of sensitive data not tagged or marked in any way. It looks like any other email with an attachment. And so I would caution you, if you are concerned about where might there be hidden sensitive data, I am telling you, it's in your email. Okay. I did want to specifically highlight GDPR because it is the one that is kind of leading the charge, and it is already in force and has been for a little while now. CCPA comes online at the start of the year. And so I just wanted to kind of point out there are some serious penalties involved in GDPR, CCPA as well. And just to give you a feel, these have already happened. GDPR has only been in force for a few months, and this has already been taken out on organizations. So if you work for a big, probably B2C type organization, get on it. But even if you don't, if you work for different types of organizations, eventually this is going to trickle down to you as well. Okay. So in order to really meet data privacy regulations, you have to be you have to be able to answer these questions. If you cannot answer definitively and frankly down at the content level, you are going to need some sort of classification. Obviously, I would argue for auto classification because it's going to do all of these things automatically and quite quickly compared to a human effort. Just for comparison purposes, a person is probably, if they're good and they know what they're doing, what they're looking for, are going to be able to get through roughly 1 file a minute. Software is going to get through 1 terabyte a day. So you do the math. Okay, so let's take PII as a prominent area of sensitive data. PII is a US term for personally identifiable information. It's a lot like personal data in the EU. And basically, same idea. So these blue things here up at the top, here's that metadata tagging step, tag, 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 tag. And the black is the rule saying, okay, now that I have these tags, I'm pretty sure that this is going to need protection, this type of document, or this is responsive to a DSAR. You'll notice the word redaction down here. The most sophisticated auto classification platforms will also handle auto redaction. And so, yeah, you can have content stored, redacted, unredacted, depends on your user access and so on. So you can get pretty fancy on where you go. The trick is to be able to identify the PII and to have a set of rules about how to manage it. You have lots and lots of implementation options. Okay, so we get into this issue of data privacy versus legal hold. This kind of fascinates me personally because data privacy would suggest, no, you may not have that information on me. I have a right to be forgotten. And legal hold says, well, I'm going to hold that information. I don't care who or what you are or what it is, because it is responsive to a litigation. And so these are inherently at conflict. And it is particularly so across country borders, because in the European Union, data privacy is considered a fundamental legal right, like kind of the right to free speech. Not so much in the United States, but certainly over there, whereas legal hold in the United States particularly is really seen as sacrosanct. Thou shalt not violate legal hold. And so you can see how these come into conflict. There is not a good resolution of this right now. Sometimes legal hold wins, sometimes data privacy wins. I am raising it here to all of you, particularly if you're involved in anything on a multinational scale, as an issue that you will need to think about and that you will encounter. I do not really have the answer. As an American citizen and as an American company, I tend to hear more about legal hold dominating data privacy. I suspect those of you in European organizations might argue the latter. So I'll put it out there and you all can debate amongst yourselves at the happy hour. Okay, taking us now into data security. And so we get asked this a lot. So is auto classification secure storage? Not really. Auto classification is an abstracted layer, and it can certainly recommend storage and integrate with federated security. But at its heart, that's really not what auto classification is doing. It's kind of like that abstracted layer saying this is what you should do, but it's ultimately someone else's responsibility. So it does facilitate the assessment, implementation, and frankly, compliance of a data security strategy. So I wanted to make that subtle difference. Particularly a number of kind of security oriented vendors will say, oh yeah, auto classification. They're really not. They're really focusing on security, and auto classification is really focusing on the nature of the content, not necessarily the securitization of it. So wanted to stress that with you guys. And then finally, into the legal end of things, e-discovery and legal hold. So e-discovery is at this point a pretty mature process. However, it is immature in a couple of key ways. Generally, e-discovery is running on a copy of content, which is really a shame because it's expensive, it's point in time, it tends to lag in getting thrown out. It's just kind of a whole lot of extraneous secondary operation. Whereas if you had proper information governance of your content in the first place, you could kind of pre-set up, or what they call litigation readiness. You can make your e-discovery much, much simpler because you can filter through content on all those delicious facets that you created earlier, so that coming up with rules on relevance and privilege are very simple efforts. Instead of requiring armies of contract attorneys to sit there and look through content, have the software do it and do it in advance as long as it's tagging anyway. And so it's a much more efficient technique for e-discovery when you consider auto-classification as part of information governance. Because e-discovery really is a subset of information governance, a kind of on-demand crisis, where if you've already got your house in order, becomes a much, much smaller deal. And then finally into legal hold. So legal hold, same thing. You can dynamically govern content. That is, this content now needs to be under legal hold on the basis of X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z are the facets that you've previously determined. So setting up a legal hold, and as I mentioned earlier, taking it down when it's no longer relevant is quite an easy step, again, in that set it and forget it type of approach. All right, that takes us into the kind of final portion of our presentation, case studies. And since I can't really be interactive with you all while I'm recording this in advance, I'm just going to talk you through some of the case studies, and it'll go a little faster. So we have I have two different case studies for you to think about, a large company and a smaller company, because I think the information governance requirements are quite different. So in the larger company, this is a large, complex multinational oil and energy company, uh, you know, 90,000 employees worldwide, and quite decentralized information management. Why? Because they've grown by mergers and acquisitions over the last 25 years. And so the initial use case was yet another acquisition where 200 terabytes of data was being received and not the staff who knew what it was. And so this is a common refrain that we hear with M&A. Here's a bunch of data, good luck with that. Because oil and energy is quite a litigious sector, it was very important that that content of unknown who knows was be assessed for what is it, that's that metadata tagging, and is it or is it not, should it or should it not be under legal hold across a wide swath of, let's say, 70 different litigation matters. Is this content subject to any of those or multiple? Okay, that's a pretty complex job that would be exceptionally difficult to do by hand, and kind of a breeze for auto classification, because it's first going to go through every piece of content and say, oh, here's what it is. Then it's going to look at the rule set and go, is that responsive to that litigation? Yeah, it is. And tag it as legal hold per matter. And so very slick, smart use of auto classification. And once that was done, of course, and this is my point earlier, if you're going to do one analysis, do them all. And that is where we headed. So started out with legal hold, but as long as you're in there, right, might as well, got any rot in there that we could just get rid of and stop carrying around? Of course they had rot, about 30% rot. Can we get rid of that? Or can we at least sequester it so it doesn't come up from searches? Okay, and as long as we're looking at this content, anything not under legal hold, can we look at a retention schedule? Because at best, it was under retention schedule of the acquired company, which is totally different than the new company. The one who acquired it had their own retention schedule, so it had to be reassessed. Again, it's a great example of data in flight and data needing all kinds of analysis upon arrival. And you can just kind of see what all of these are as we moved through the different applications. It's all the same data source. It was all the same data the whole time, but about 8 different applications and analyses being performed on the basis of auto classification. Just so you know, RFL, that stood for recommended file location. That tends to go with migration. So, get it off of this drive, get it up into the Azure cloud in the right locations with the right tags, and set it all up for the future. And that is exactly what took place. A very smart use of auto classification. Here's another one. Oops, well, don't look at the bottom. We had a little bit of a a build issue here. So case study 2 is a regional retailer. Retailers tend to have a lot of personnel, right? Everybody working the register and out on the floor. Um, and many retailers have not invested in fancy systems because they're operating literally brick and mortar businesses. And so their HR practice, which was responsible for so many personnel, was literally run on paper. And so after scanning in the paper, they sort of said, okay, now what? Now we have a bunch of scanned images. What do we do with that? And so what was built was, yes, all right, digitize, and then create searchable content that's using OCR, and then let the auto classification do its thing, pull out contextual metadata about their world, the store ID, the personnel, employment status, what's their title, what's their hourly rate, start date, promotion date, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very custom specific analysis of content. There we go. And then, 5,000 people with a constant turnover in employees, lots of rot, lots of past retention. Even the concept of retention was new to them. The fact that you could get rid of content was a big eye opener, but you can only get rid of it if you can actually assess what it is. And so again, this is a much kind of smaller organization with smaller systems. And don't get me wrong, this was not a tiny, I mean, they're probably 500, $600 million organization, but they're not an international, oil and energy company. And the same type of technology is perfectly applicable in both scenarios. So what we're getting to here is this notion. You'll notice that both of the case studies kind of ended in perpetual evergreen management and control of content, because that is the ultimate goal of auto classification. It's not a one and done. It's not classify and step away. It's classify and manage forever. And so we have kind of coined this term, data under management, to explain that. It's similar to lifecycle management, but it has a kind of auto classification bent to it. Yes, lifecycle management, but let the software do it start to finish. So starts at birth. Again, software is aware of the birth of content and what it is at birth. A kind of informed disposition at the get-go, from birth status to active status, any other kind of special circumstances, and then ultimately final disposition. Again, using refresh. You'll notice I kind of crossed out time-based. I know people like it, but I think I made my case pretty strongly as to what's wrong with that. And then into perpetual management and control. This is the notion of data under management. And finally, this is one last thought for all of you, because most folks that I talk to from the various ARMA chapters and in the national conferences, they really understand auto classification. They get it, they love it. And their issue is convincing their organizations to invest. And so I've been asked so many times to pull this together. So I am doing so, and it's the final topic we're going to cover today, which is how to build and boost ROI. And I'm just going to give it to you straight. Start with a compelling pilot use case. Don't try to boil the ocean. Start with a set of data, my recommendation, that is not being managed. You inherited it from an M&A and nobody's touching it. Departed employee files, abandoned file shares. Start with those kind of things, because no one is particularly going to complain and no one's really taking ownership anyway. You might as well. Start with rot removal. You're going to be able to instantly prove about a 30 or 40% return on storage costs. That alone is probably, depending on the cost of storage, whether you're, if you're on really old depreciated equipment, that's one thing. If you're up in the cloud already, you're going to be able to afford 15 different auto classification tools for the cost of 30% of your storage. So keep an eye. Once you start with a pilot use case, keep an eye on future use cases. What I strongly recommend is once you have the pilot, and the pilot's going to go well because they almost always do, use that as a showcase. Make sure the rest of your organization sees the success of that pilot. Have innovation day or pilot showcase day, and look for future use cases that fit. So I'll give an example. An early one that we have done for clients is they have a whole bunch of contracts that nobody's ever looked at in years. They don't know if they're still in force. They don't know what they say. And so using auto classification to classify contracts, let's say across 3-4 different repositories, and create that centralized dashboard view, that translates very easy into other departments. Another department might be finance and say, oh, wow, we do something similar. We store invoices across systems and we don't know what they say. Or HR is going to look and then say, oh, that's really similar. We store resumes or we store termination letters and we don't know what they say. That kind of thing. If you can find a use case that has broad applicability and can be relatively easily translated to other departments, you're going to find takers. Run a pilot and benchmark the results. How strong were they? Where will you need to increase your guidance or get subject matter expertise going forward? This is really important. Software folks are good, but they're not infallible. You and your organization know your content better than any software provider. And so be prepared to provide that kind of guidance, because a good auto classification system should be customizable. And that customization is a hand-in-hand effort between the subject matter experts and the software experts. So be aware of your role in that. Also make sure that you benchmark, because you're going to want to know what the performance was. How many files per second or per processor? How many gigabytes or terabytes per day? Because as you scale up, you're going to need that information to build a properly scaled system. And then finally, build your ROI on the pilot alone. If your pilot is just rot removal, you're going to be set. Everything you do after that is then gravy. And so you can take that same auto classification engine that recognized rot and do all the other fancy stuff. You'll already have made your case on the rot. So that's my advice to all of you as to how to get your project approved. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but make sure you spread the word. The best way to move from a pilot to full implementation is to make sure other people know about the success. And that finally brings us to the end of the master class on auto classification. I'm Sandy Serkes. I enjoyed speaking with all of you virtually. I hope you will come visit us at our booth, or if you are reviewing this after the fact, please come visit us at our website. We would love to hear from you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, and goodbye.